This week on the other side, Australia's moment of shame. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese refusing to follow world leaders and stand up for liberal democracy. If we can't stand up for the values of our culture anymore, just how low have we sunk as a nation of principle? It's time to stand up for ourselves and our values. We'll hear from a lot of strong world leaders who did, and we'll analyse Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's interview with CNN, in which he faces the tough questions about Israel's approach to this war.
Tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, including countless children, have been killed and maimed by the IDF in your war against Hamas. Is there anything you and the IDF could have done any differently to avoid all the loss of innocent lives in Gaza?
The answer is coming up. Also this week, the Iranian President leaves this world in an inferno fit for a butcher of innocence, and nobody cares. But what will happen next? The UK is going to have an election sooner than we thought, very soon in fact, we'll find out why. And Daily Wire's Matt Walsh has a hilarious take on the reaction to his comments last week about Australia seemingly becoming a nation of woke wimps. You won't want to miss that. G'day Brisbane, g'day Wollongong, g'day Australia. This is The Other Side, episode 314 for the weekend commencing Friday, the 24th of May, 2024. I'm Damien Curry, and welcome to the show that brings you a small government adult view of the world on a shoestring budget, not a childish ABC view of the world on a billion-dollar budget of other people's money, pushing the tragic country-wrecking idea that the government should fix everything for us and will take care of us. This is the show for adults, for grown-ups, for smart people. Your weekly take on the news and commentary of the past 7 days from a classical liberal centre-right perspective. This is The Other Side. In what may be the final nail in the coffin for many decent people's respect for international institutions, the top prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, applied for arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his Defence Minister this week, alleging that they were responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Today, we underline in the clearest possible fashion that international law and the laws of armed conflict apply to everyone.
ICC prosecutor Karim Khan there. He took this move at the same time as seeking charges against Hamas leaders, as if to imply that he's being fair and balanced, as if there's some kind of moral equivalence between the elected government of a democracy that participates in the international community as a normal functional partner and a brutal terrorist organisation that managed to threaten its way to power in a small regional government. Let's be clear, there isn't. And if you know someone who even thinks for 1 second that there could possibly be a moral equivalence between the Israeli government and Hamas, then it's time to suggest to them that they need to rejoin the real world, study some world history, some global affairs and some international relations. Even wishy-washy old Joe Biden was having none of it.
Whatever these warrants may imply, there is no equivalence between Israel and Hamas. What's happening is not genocide. We reject that. We will always stand with Israel and the threats against its security.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak swiftly agreed.
Well, this is a deeply unhelpful development. Of course, it's still subject to final decision, but it remains deeply unhelpful nonetheless. There is no moral equivalence between a democratic state exercising its lawful right to self-defense and the terrorist group Hamas.
UK PM Rishi Sunak. Germany, France, Austria, Poland and the Czech Republic all issued similar condemnations very quickly. Even Canada's Peter Pan PM Justin Trudeau seems to get it.
Obviously, the International Criminal Court is independent in its work, and I've said from the very beginning how important it is that everyone respect and abide by international law. What I will say is troubling, though, is the sense of an equivalency between the democratically elected leaders of Israel and the bloodthirsty terrorists that lead up Hamas. I don't think that's helpful.
But in what must be the greatest example of Anthony Albanese's lack of any leadership capability or spine or commitment to the traditional liberal democratic order and the Western world and his ability to stand up to it? Our Prime Minister put us to shame. He did not have the moral backbone or just the basic decency to make a strong statement. He made no comment and then ran for cover. Here's how the ABC reported that Tuesday.
Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said he would not comment on a case that was before court.
We are concentrating, playing a role where we can in promoting the right of both Israelis and Palestinians to live in security, in peace and with prosperity.
That all sounds very nice, but it actually says nothing. The Prime Minister said he would not comment on a case that was before the International Criminal Court. Why? Every other democratic world leader spoke out. Ireland and Denmark were quite supportive of the ICC in their statements, but they still raised eyebrows at the hint of a moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas. And there is no convention that cases before the ICC are beyond critique or commentary. The ICC only exists by convention and loose agreement. It's an intergovernmental international tribunal that's seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. It was set up in 2002. Its Wikipedia entry says that it's the first and only permanent international court with jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for the international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crimes of aggression. And that's different to the International Court of Justice, which is an organ of the United Nations that hears disputes between states. Supporters of the ICC say that its existence is a major step towards justice. But some governments have refused to recognise it, and some accuse it of bias, Eurocentrism, and racism. Could that be why they're so keen to create the appearance of moral equivalence between a Western-style liberal democracy like Israel and a terrorist organisation like Hamas? If so, there lies the big problem here. We have just got to stop with this, oh, we're all equal, we're all the same. No, we aren't. Modern Western liberal democracies are the most advanced civilizations and have the most just systems of government and courts and rule of law ever known to mankind. And we have to stand up for them and all of that, or we will lose it. We're not just like those Gazans and Hamas. Liberal democracy is not a club you just leap into either. Centuries of thought and blood went into building what we enjoy today. So there is no equivalency. Sorry. Sure, we aren't perfect by far, and we shouldn't get arrogant or full of hubris, and we need to act respectfully and morally towards other countries, but our systems, our processes, our rule of law, they are superior. I'm sorry, equality-obsessed lefties. There is a hierarchy. There are good and bad things and better and best things in the world. And if these global organisations keep behaving the way they do, then the resurgence of nationalism that we're starting to see gets stronger, and people will just walk away from all of these supranational bodies, which might be a big shame. But then again, if they continue to act like this, maybe not. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's super weak response to the news that the International Criminal Court was implying that the democratic government of Israel and the terrorists of Hamas were kind of morally the same led to a huge backlash. Then, finally, on Wednesday, Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, not Albo, the Prime Minister, not Penny Wong, the Foreign Affairs Minister, no, Jimbo, the Treasurer, came out and said this.
The issuing of arrest warrants is fundamentally an issue for the ICC. We respect the very important role that the ICC has to play here. We're not party to those decisions or part of those decisions to pursue those arrest warrants. Our focus as Australians is we desperately need to see the end of the killing of innocent people in Gaza. We desperately need to see that. And so our efforts, our focus has been to use our voice in the international community to argue for a humanitarian ceasefire, to argue for the release of the hostages.
All that stuff is just too easy to say, folks. It all sounds so nice and right and good, but what does, quote, arguing for a humanitarian ceasefire, unquote, actually mean? Does that mean Israel has to put the lives of its own soldiers and sons at risk, and that it needs to give more time to Hamas to organise and regroup and plan counterattacks? How much does Israel actually have to do? When will we give them our unequivocal support to fight this vile enemy? All Hamas has to do to save the lives of innocent Gazans is to surrender and hand back the hostages. All the Arab world has to do to save innocent Gazans is open the Egyptian border to the refugees. We also now know there's plenty of tunnels between Rafah and Egypt. Surprise. There are also many, many ways that rich Arab oil states who are worried about Gazans could help them get out and provide asylum. Why is it always Israel's responsibility, even after the obscenity of October the 7th? I mean, is there no point at which we support our own liberal democratic world's culture anymore? At least Chalmers did fall into line with other world leaders on the moral equivalence nonsense of the ICC. Sort of.
There is no equivalence between Hamas, the terrorist organisation, and Israel. We have made it really clear in condemning the actions of Hamas on October 7. We've made it very clear that we want to see the hostages released, and we've made it really clear that we want to see the Israeli response comply completely with international humanitarian law.
The opposition leader, Peter Dutton, went a lot further and stronger and actually looked like a leader, all very quickly on Tuesday, calling the suggestion of an equivalence repugnant.
My view is that Australia should stand shoulder to shoulder with President Biden, and he's shown the strength of leadership to stand up against this equivalence, which is completely and utterly repugnant. To compare the Israeli Prime Minister to a terrorist organisation leader and to not have some clarity in relation to it, I think is appalling. The Prime Minister squibbed it today when he was asked about this issue, and the Prime Minister had the opportunity at the ICC, where Australia was consulted in relation to this matter. They didn't weigh in and say that they were against this measure. Instead, they sat on the sideline and had nothing to say about it at all. Now, I don't know why the Prime Minister is not showing leadership at the moment on the economy. He's not showing leadership in relation to anti-Semitism, and he's tarnishing and damaging our international relationships with like-minded nations when he's not strong enough to stand up alongside President Biden. And I very strongly support the comments of Joe Biden today in relation to the ICC. It's an abomination, and it needs to be ceased.
Australia's Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, there, speaking like a leader on Tuesday, as any strong leader should have. The charges against Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu and his Defence Minister focus on a claim that Israel was deliberately not letting aid in and trying to starve people as part of its war effort. But in one of the number of interviews that he did with American media outlets this week, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told CNN's Jake Tapper that the charges are simply absurd.
I think these charges are exactly as President Biden called them. They're outrageous. They're beyond outrageous. This is a rogue prosecutor that has put false charges and created false symmetries that are both dangerous and false. And the first false symmetry is he equates the democratically elected leaders of Israel with the terrorist tyrants of Hamas. That's like saying that, well, I'm issuing, arrest warrants for FDR and Churchill, but also for Hitler. Or I'm issuing arrest warrants for George W. Bush, but also for bin Laden. That's absurd. Secondly, the charges are completely false. Let's take this charge of starvation. We've put in 500,000 tons of trucks of food and medicine for this population. We've taken 20,000 trucks. We've paved roads to put those trucks in. We've opened border crossings that Hamas closed down. I've had airdrops that are facilitated, sea route supplies. I mean, the whole thing is absurd.
CNN's Jake Tapper made the point that as well as the ICC, many others have also said not enough was being done by Israel to get aid in. like President Biden, who expressed concerns.
Well, no, we had the same concerns. We were trying to get the aid in. We got the aid in, and Hamas was looting. This was my directive from day one. The day one thing was we have to provide, we comport with international law. We comport with the rules of war. We have to get those trucks in. We're getting hundreds of trucks every day in. And that's been an aspect of our conduct of war, because we try to get civilians out of harm's way. We've done things that no country, no army has done in history. It's not me saying that. It's General Petraeus saying that. The head of the urban warfare at West Point, Colonel John Spencer, says it. Israel's gone out of its way both in humanitarian aid and getting civilians out of harm's way with millions of text messages, millions of phone calls and leaflets that we've been dropping, giving up the element of surprise. Israel is given here a bum rap. It's I think it's dangerous, because basically it's the first democracy that is being taken to the dock when it is doing exactly what democracy should be doing in an exemplary way. I think it will endanger all other democracies. Israel may be first. You're next. Britain is next. Others are next too.
He's right. It's the flow-on effect of this that's troubling. And credit to Jake Tapper at CNN for what was perhaps the most important question of the interview. Watch this.
Let me ask you, because what Hamas did on October 7th, just to make this clear, what Hamas did is abhorrent, as is the refusal to return the hostages. Abhorrent. But whether or not it was Israel's intent, tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians, including countless children, have been killed and maimed by the IDF in your war against Hamas. Is there anything you and the IDF could have done any differently to avoid all the loss of innocent lives in Gaza?
First of all, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. Every child lost, or every woman lost, or every innocent person lost is a tragedy. But for Hamas, it's a strategy. So while we go out of our way to get them out of harm's way, Hamas goes out of its way to keep them in harm's way, shooting at them if they try to leave the battle zones. But many have left. Thankfully, I can say that. Now, the ratio, because of our actions, the ratio of civilians to combatants killed is the lowest in the history of urban warfare, and certainly dense urban warfare like this. It's about 1-to-1.
And Prime Minister Netanyahu said he believes the numbers are also inflated.
And let me tell you, I think that the numbers are also inflated. You know, the UN, the UN organizations that are dominated by Hamas in Gaza is giving false information, as is Hamas itself. And people believe these numbers.
Whatever the numbers are, it's too many.
In the meantime, the lie circles. Well, look, yes, one is too many, but the reason they're there, the reason we have civilian casualties at all, is because Hamas is preventing them from leaving. I'm happy to say that in the Rafah operation that we've conducted, 1 million people actually left. People said, well, there are 1 million people, 1.2 million in Gaza. Where are they going to go? They're going to be trapped. Well, 1,950,000 have already left. And there are very few civilian casualties because we're doing everything to get them out.
That was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking to CNN's Jake Tapper this week in one of a number of interviews he did with US media outlets. Mr. Netanyahu told CNN he has a very clear plan for post-war Gaza, firmly responding to critics who say he doesn't. First, it's to defeat Hamas completely and release the rest of the hostages, which will end the intense part of the fighting, he says. Then he says Israel must have sustained ongoing security forces in Gaza to maintain the peace. Then there will be a Gaza administration set up, made up of local Gazans, the kind who don't want to wipe Israel off the map and kill all of its citizens. They'll run the civilian administration. And he says there will be no Jewish settlements in Gaza. Mr. Netanyahu says he makes no apology for that position or plan, despite there being some dissent from his own opposition. Something really big happened last month that we haven't yet had the time to pay close attention to on this show, but we must. In the UK, there was an independent review of gender identity services for children and young people that was commissioned by the government health service over there, the NHS. It was headed up by a retired paediatrician, that's a children's medical specialist, and she's the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics, in fact, a woman named Hilary Cass. The review was set up to look at gender services for children and young people, including those identifying as transgender. They handed down their final report last month, and the recommendations have had the backing of both the Conservative and the Labor parties in the UK, and they've been adopted by the NHS now. So, what did it find? And what are we doing in Australia? Well, it found that the people in charge of devising the approach by which doctors handled kids with transgender issues had not been subjected to the usual control measures. Children with mental illness, for example, weren't getting proper psychological support, and endocrinologists, the hormone doctors, were administering puberty blockers and did not go to meetings with other specialists like psychologists or other doctors to refine their treatments. They just operated as a law unto themselves. This is very damning stuff. It shows that all the things that they were telling us are perhaps not true. Oh, you know, these kids are getting the best psychological support. Nobody has an incentive to push them into hormone treatment and puberty blockers. Yeah, right. Well, that turns out to have been bulldust. They weren't getting the right mix of support or any psychological support. They were subject to an approach called affirmation care. Dr. David Bell used to be the governor at the NHS who had oversight of the clinic in the UK that was doing all this treatment. And he sounded alarm bells in his own report back in 2018. He explained what this affirmation care approach is all about.
Affirmation means if a girl comes along and says, I can't stand being a girl, I need to be a boy, you affirm that and agree. That's a totally inappropriate clinical stance. And Hilary Cass has underlined that many times. And that's an example of ideology, namely a kind of claimed human rights agenda, capturing what should have been a clinical domain.
And that is not good. It's very, very bad indeed, because it tosses out the rule book on how we're supposed to do medical treatment, especially when it comes to kids.
The ordinary canons of clinical care, the need to maintain neutrality, the need to maintain a certain distance, the need to take a holistic approach and think of a child in the narrative of their life and their cultural and social links and their family, all that was abandoned.
Affirmation care is like taking advice on whether to be vegetarian from a vegan. You know the answer before you even ask the question. But the most damning bit of the report was the finding that those in charge of the clinical approach to transgender kids felt, quote, under pressure to adopt an unquestioning affirmative approach, overshadowing other issues such as poor mental health. Oh my God. This makes me so mad. We're taking kids who think they are trans, not giving them any other kind of psychological care, and saying, okay, well, let's pop you on the old puberty blockers then, because, well, it's the politically correct thing to do. Never mind what's morally or ethically correct. Now, look, I believe some people have gender dysphoria. I guess it's hard to know unless you walk in their skin how it must feel to really believe that you're in the wrong body from the gender that you believe you are. But it's very, very, very rare, and this is a deeply, deeply complex issue that can't be solved by people with an ideology to push. And I just don't think we can do these treatments on kids, except in the rarest of rare cases. The approach must be that we can't let this become a social contagion or a fad among kids, that we have to be able to sort out the kids who really are suffering from those who aren't. And that can only be done with proper psychological counselling over a long period of time from someone who is not biased towards one ideology over another. And the decision must ultimately be made by the child's parents up until they are 18. Government, the state, has no place interfering in the primary family rights. Let's be very clear here. The final Cass report included several systematic reviews of scientific literature carried out by the University of York. The report states, when the review started, the evidence base, particularly in relation to the use of puberty blockers and masculinizing or feminizing hormones, had already been shown to be weak. and that after the examination over 100 pieces of potential evidence, that there continues to be a lack of high quality evidence in this area. In a nutshell, the report said that medical interventions are not the best way to manage gender distress in many cases. And where it is needed, it must happen with some psychological care too. Here's how the UK's Channel 4 News reported Hilary Cass's findings.
She said for most young people, a medical pathway will not be the best way to manage their gender-related distress. But for those young people for whom a medical pathway is clinically indicated, it's not enough to provide this without also addressing wider mental health or psychosocially challenging problems. She found that despite a considerable amount of published research in this field internationally, the quality was poor, meaning there's not a reliable evidence base upon which to make clinical decisions or for children and their families to make informed choices. She also said that there was weak evidence regarding the impact of puberty blockers on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health, while the effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown.
Channel 4 actually spoke to Hilary Cass, and here's what she had to say about how political debate about gender ideology has been impacting care.
I think it's definitely the case that ideology on all sides has directed care rather than care being directed by normal principles of paediatrics and mental health.
Okay, so on the basis of no good science whatsoever, we've just accepted the ideology of gender studies academics at modern woke universities and powered forward with the idea that the way to treat kids who have gender distress is puberty blockers, hormone therapy, and in some cases surgery. That's quite a radical approach based on very little science. And even if it was the right approach for a very small number of kids, there's still a massive ethical question about whether we should be doing this sort of thing at all to any child, ever, regardless of the distress they may be in, that there might be better ways to help them cope with that distress. And we certainly need to involve people other than doctors in the treatment, like psychologists, for example. So whether you think medical interventions might help or not, we've jumped the gun big time. And we've been pushed to do so and shouted down by gender studies ideologues whose positions are emotional and political, not rational or based on science. And if that's the case, then this is a social shame of monstrous proportions that we all should be working to stop immediately. One journalist who spent a lot of time on this is former BBC producer Hannah Barnes. She wrote a book on it all a few years ago called Time to Think. The premise being that there were too many cases of trans kids reaching adulthood and then regretting that the path they took with puberty blockers and surgery was wrong and wanting to go back, but the damage having already been done. She spoke to Channel 4 about how puberty blocker treatment started at an NHS clinic in the UK and then went through the roof in terms of demand.
This service experienced an exponential growth in the number of young people being referred to it, children distressed around their gender identity, and at the same time had rolled out an innovative new treatment, puberty blockers, to try and help those children with that distress. Now, it started off well-intentioned. Here was an intervention that could seemingly help those young people, but they then started referring children for this quite new treatment for whom it wasn't meant for. And what's happened now is a doctor has come in and said, we can't continue like this. We don't do this in other areas of medicine. We don't prescribe powerful drugs without knowing that they're safe and clinically effective. And that's effectively where we are now. We're bringing in trans medicine, if you like, in line with the rest of healthcare, because it's not fair that this group of children who are very vulnerable and very distressed receive a poorer standard of care than anybody else should expect.
And let's just be really clear why this is happening, right? It's happening because of this woke ideology infecting and infesting everybody so that everybody's too scared to say, hang on a minute, we're going too fast here, we don't really have the science. Oh, you're a transphobe. You know, that's it. That's what's driving this. It's really, really sick. NHS England has responded immediately, shutting down its main unit responsible for setting the clinical guidelines, and puberty-suppressing hormones are no longer being routinely made available in the NHS Youth Gender Services. New patients who might be assessed as being suitable for them will be required to participate in a clinical trial that's being set up to work out whether they actually do work, and more research is going to be commissioned into the whole approach. The Scottish Government has said that it'll take the time to consider the findings, and in the meantime will pause prescribing puberty blockers to children, referred to its special gender clinic. So what are we doing about it in Australia? A joint statement from Equality Australia and the Australian Professional Association for Trans Health didn't show any remorse or humility or concern. It just said the CAS review downplays the risk of denying treatment to young people with gender dysphoria and limits their options by placing restrictions on their access to care. What? I thought it did the exact opposite. I thought it said that the trans-focused medical community were the ones clearly not putting all the options on the table for kids and parents, and were instead driving them down one path of treatment by over-emphasising puberty blockers and surgical intervention. Gee, I must have read it all wrong. Hilary Cass herself had a few things to say about all the reaction to her report. She says she copped abusive emails and had been told officially to avoid public transport. And she said this: if you deliberately try to undermine a report that has looked at the evidence of children's healthcare, then that is unforgivable. You are putting children at risk by doing that. She told the New York Times that her review was not trying to suggest in any way that trans people do not exist. That's absolutely not what we're saying. And there are young people who absolutely benefit from a medical pathway, and we need to make sure that those young people have access, but not assume that that's the right pathway for everyone. That sounds very, very fair and reasonable to me. In one of the most baffling moves by any political party anywhere in the world, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, called an early election for the country on July the 4th, in a move that looks like some kind of act of political hari-kari. It's long been thought that the Conservative Party, the Tories as they call them over there, will lose the next election to Labor, and that the Labor Party head, Keir Starmer, will be the UK's next Prime Minister. But an election wasn't due until November, and analysts like the Spectator magazine chairman and revered political commentator and journalist Andrew Neil are baffled by the PM's plan to go 4 months early.
So I think we've reached a time when the country stopped listening to the Tories. It happened to John Major in 97. It doesn't matter what the Tories say. People just say, nah, you've had your time.
Yeah.
You've had enough. We're not gagging for Keir Starmer in the way that we really wanted Tony Blair to be our new Prime Minister in 97. We're not gagging for him, but your time is up. And I don't think there's much they can do about that. The Tories have a mountain to climb to win the election whenever it is. Pretty much, I think, mission impossible. But if they had a chance, it was a better chance in November than July.
Why is that?
Because a number of things are now coming right. Not in big ways, not ways that will convince the electorate, but it will be more obvious that they've come right by November.
That's Andrew Neil speaking to Spectator TV. He says inflation is just starting to come down and wages are starting to rise again. So if Sunak had waited until November, he might have had a better chance of winning, or more likely not losing so badly. Also, once an election is called in the UK, the central bank isn't allowed to change interest rates until after the vote, so there can be no interest rate drop before the election, which kind of makes the timing really weird. Some say it might be that they want to go before the expected wave of illegal immigrant boats coming across the channel in summer.
And we're about to get some, not the illegal migration of the boat people, but we're about to get new migration figures coming out this week, which will not be great for the government. There will still be a lot more than people want, and won't reflect the recent steps the government's taken to cut legal migration. But lo and behold, we would have had the impact of these steps by the autumn.
Yeah.
It'll be irrelevant by then. So it is why I'm genuinely baffled. I can think of no good reason other than that Rishi Sunak's had enough and he wants out.
That's Andrew Neil on Spectator TV in the UK, and you can catch Spectator TV Australia with Alexandra Marshall right here on ADH TV, of course. Now, if you did want to make sure that you would lose an election, you couldn't do a better job of putting together an announcement press conference than the clowns in the UK Conservative Party PR team. This was how the announcement started.
In the last 5 years, our country has fought through the most challenging times since the Second World War. As I stand here as your Prime Minister, I can't help but reflect that my first proper introduction to you was just over 4 years ago.
And then, within 30 seconds, as if on cue, the rain started to come down.
I have never and will never leave the people of this country to face the darkest of days alone. And you know that because you've seen it.
2 minutes later, by the time he actually got to announcing the election, Rishi Sunak was drenched.
Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
To make matters even more poetic and symbolic of the current state of the mother country, a random protester was standing at the gates of Downing Street just half a block away, blasting the Labor Party theme song, "Things Can Only Get Better," at full volume.
This election will take place at a time when the world is more dangerous than it has been since the end of the Cold War. Putin's Russia is waging a brutal war in Ukraine and will not stop there if he succeeds. That war has also made it all too clear the risk to our energy security. In the Middle East, the forces of Islamist extremism threaten regional and ultimately global stability. These tensions are exploited by extremists who seek to undermine our values and divide our society here at home. China is looking to dominate the 21st century by stealing a lead in technology. And migration is being weaponized by hostile states to threaten the integrity of our borders. And these uncertain times call for a clear plan and bold action to chart a course to a secure future.
And yet, amid all those threats to the Western liberal democratic world order, the UK can't even organise an umbrella for its Prime Minister or a police officer to seize the portable speakers from a protester. What more do you need to know about the shambolic state we're all in right now? So this happened on Monday.
Major search operation is underway after a helicopter carrying Iran's president and its foreign minister crashed in the northwest of the country in thick fog.
He was not a nice bloke. Associate Professor William Spaniel is an expert in strategic game theory and political science at the University of Pittsburgh in the US, and he produces excellent YouTube videos. He explains why Raisi, elected president in 2021, was so unloved.
Raisi was a hardliner, known by his detractors as the Butcher of Tehran, for his role in the 1988 execution of thousands of political prisoners on the order of Ayatollah Khomeini. His time in office saw a strengthening of Iran's axis of resistance against the West and Western-aligned parties in the region, with alleged increased proxy support to Hamas, Hezbollah, the Syrian government, and the Houthis.
Wow, that's really all the good guys they're backing there. As we've said before on the show, we need to always look at Middle East politics through the lens of the region's two big powers and the cold and often hot war between them. That's Iran and Saudi Arabia. It really does seem like the crash was an accident. Old helicopters in thick fog are not a good mix, and the president's decision to fly was his alone. If it was foul play, it could have been any number of actors. Lots of countries have a beef with Iran's government right now, including factions inside Iran itself. What's important is what could happen next. Back to Professor Spaniel.
I know that it is tempting to say, hey, it was just the president, not the Ayatollah, so none of this matters. But that is oversimplifying things. It matters for here, and here, and here, back to here, obviously, and here, and here, and even here. Oh, and it also matters for this.
Yes, Iran is always on the verge of building a nuclear weapon. So what actually could happen?
In the immediate aftermath, the question turned to whether foul play was involved. Political scientists find such operations particularly concerning because the absence of obvious attribution makes it impossible to sustain a situation where no one wants to take the opportunity that is in front of them. Here, if so many countries do not like Iran at the moment, someone will be tempted to commit a sabotage operation, given the default suspicion might fall elsewhere. But that ironically makes the likelier suspects tempted to attack, because there is no guarantee that it will trace back to them. And we know from some recent attacks on Iranian targets that this can lead to some more serious escalation concerns, even if a true powder keg has not yet exploded. However, the prevailing theory at the moment is that this is just a case of bad piloting. If the Kobe Bryant crash from 2020 taught the public anything, it is that helicopters and fog do not mix. Now, I realize that this argument is a bit circular, but for the sake of world peace, it is fortunate that the crash happened in bad weather conditions, and not under clear blue skies.
Yes, it is. Given there probably isn't an outside player at work here, the focus falls back onto the implications for Iran itself. What happens next inside the country, which is already experiencing rising popular discontent among young people towards the authoritarian and conservative government.
The crash raises both long-term and short-term political power problems within the Islamic Republic. In the long run, Raisi was a consensus likely successor to Ayatollah Khamenei, and indeed, Khamenei himself took the president to Ayatollah path. According to Iran's constitution, Iran's first vice president becomes acting president once the Ayatollah gives his consent, which he already has done. The successor's politics appear roughly similar to his predecessors, and he comes pre-sanctioned by Western leaders. So that is not the important story here. Instead, the government has 50 days to run another election to fill the position properly. Election days are frightening times for autocrats. If popular sentiment turns too far against the regime, the festive nature of Election Day itself turns into a rallying call for coordinated protests. And unless you can get out in front of them, large protests can in turn result in the fall of a government. Indeed, the disputed results of the 2009 Iranian presidential election led to just such protests across the country, though the regime endured.
All of this could move Donald Trump's Abraham Accords deal between Israel and Arab powers forward, leading to Saudi Arabia becoming involved finally. It's understood the Saudis were all set to join the accord, but then October 7 happened. In fact, one October 7 theory is that Iran supported Hamas to move on Israel precisely to stop the Saudis joining that accord. But we'll really never know, probably. Professor Spaniel says a grand bargain between the US, Israel, and the Saudis could be one thing that results from this current hiccup in Iran.
The State Department was already spending much of its bandwidth on that project, with multiple visits to the key players in question. But Israel's offensive into Rafah as a part of the Gaza war will remain a major stumbling block there. Though the Israeli domestic politics on the entire situation is about to reach a boiling point, and any serious movement may have to wait for a new prime minister. Suffice it to say that the gods of international relations chose an interesting time for a helicopter to crash. And, as usual for these sorts of breakpoints, there is a high probability that not much happens, and a low probability that a whole ton of stuff happens, with not much room in the middle for an average outcome.
Yes, indeed. That's Associate Professor William Spaniel, expert in strategic game theory and political science at the US University of Pittsburgh. And you can find his full-length explainer videos on YouTube. Last week we brought you the hilarious story of US Daily Wire conservative commentator Matt Walsh's tongue-in-cheek takedown of Australia and the reality TV show Alone. Here's a quick reminder. His assessment is based on a comparison of the American version of a reality TV show called Alone and the Australian version of the same show. Matt says that the American version's been going for 10 years and involves a bunch of trained survivalists being thrown into the jungle and being required to survive alone with just a camera to film themselves on. Last one surviving wins. Matt stumbled on the new Aussie version of the show and he thought it'd be great.
First of all, surviving in Australia would be pretty tough, you'd think. Like Australia is a dangerous place. And I also thought Australians are a hardy people. You know, I bet they could survive for months without tapping out. Usually on the American version, you know, the winner survives 90 days, maybe at most, 100 days at most. I thought Australians, like they could, this show will go on for 6 years and they won't tap out. I mean, this will be really interesting. But my opinion of Australia, I'm just being honest with you, my opinion of Australians has just plummeted. Like before COVID, I thought that Australia was, first of all, an absolute hellscape where poisonous spiders rain from the sky. That part is true, but then I further thought that because of that, anyone who lives there, these have to be like the toughest sons of on the planet. I really thought. I thought it was just I thought it was a whole country of Steve Irwins. That's what I thought. And from COVID and now ending with this, I'm like, how is Australia the weakest, wokest, lamest country on earth? How is that possible?
Matt Walsh on the Daily Wire a week or so ago. Now, if you know anything at all about Matt Walsh's humour and his entire shtick, you know that his deadpan serious delivery belies a hugely ironic piss take at modern woke culture. Unfortunately, a lot of the Aussie mainstream media don't get the humour. News.com reporter Ali Foster wrote, American podcaster brands Australia lamest country on earth in bizarre rant. An American podcaster has branded Australia lame and weak after going on an emotional anti-woke rant online. Yep, missing the joke completely, the intrepid News.com reporter Ali Foster decided to then do a classic woke, sense of humour free millennial hit piece on Matt Walsh. Writing breathlessly, Matt Walsh is a right-wing commentator whose favourite pastime is getting his knickers in a knot about people being woke and then whinging about it on the internet. Walsh is known for spewing a strong anti-transgender and anti-LGBTQ plus rhetoric. His 2022 film, What is a Woman, was heavily criticised by transgender groups and activists. In February 2023, he claimed he would rather be dead than have one of his children come out as transgender. Walsh has openly stated that same-sex couples should not be allowed to adopt children. Yeah, Ali, he's a conservative Catholic, and that's his point of view. What has that got to do with this story about his rant on the woeful state of Aussie woke reality TV? Trashy journalism, Petal, trashy stuff. This has all made Matt again rightly wonder what the heck is going on down here. And he addressed it again on his show this week. And I really hope the dopey mainstream media in Australia this time realise he is joking. Trigger warning before I play the clip. His deadpan humour style is at play again here. This is irony and comedy. Remember that? It's so sad that Aussie culture now requires jokes to be explained to death so that sad loser woke people like these Gen Y journalists don't get offended. We used to be the nation of the piss take joke. Now we've got to explain to Americans we're going to have Americans explain to us what sarcasm is. It used to be the other way around. We invented the drop bear story, for God's sake. What has happened to us, Australia? Over to you, Mr. Walsh.
I didn't realize that my comments about Australia would cause such heartache in the country of Australia. I didn't realize that you guys care so much about what I think of you. The fact that there have been multiple headlines in Australia media about my comments on Australia is surprising to me and also incredibly pathetic, especially because you'd think that there's plenty of other things happening in Australia that you'd be paying attention to instead of paying attention to me.
Indeed, there is. Matt Walsh went on to say that he knows so much about Aussie culture.
And I say this as someone who, again, always liked Australia, at least from afar. I was a big fan of Steve Irwin. I love the Bloomin' Onion from Outback Steakhouse. So I know a lot about Australian culture. I'm really steeped in Australian culture. And that's why it pains me to see what it has become. So here's what I'll say. And this is the last thing I'll say about Australia for now. And I think, and I'm not, I'm not backtracking. I'm not one to apologize, but I do want to make in a certain sense, I want to make amends with Australia. And I don't want, you guys are fragile enough down there. I don't want to cause any more pain and heartache for you. So I think there's only one solution. This is kind of my compromise. I think Australia needs to be invaded. For its own sake, we need to invade Australia and conquer it. And based on what I've seen, that'll only take about 3 or 4 hours, and the whole job will be done. And what we'll do, this is my proposal, just my proposal, is we'll round up all the woke, lame Australians, and we will drive them inland to the interior, and we'll set up like a reservation for them that they can live on. And then the cool Australians will be liberated, and we'll send them to go, live in New Zealand, which is basically Australia, but colder. It's like Australia refrigerated or something, from what I understand. And they can live there because nobody's in New Zealand right now anyway.
Nobody's in New Zealand right now. Oh, God. Oh, that is freaking comedy gold. Brilliant stuff. It gets better, though.
And then you're saying, well, what do we do with the rest of the Australian continent? My suggestion is that we get back to Australia's roots. We convert it back to a prison colony. And we'll start shipping our prisoners to Australia and, put it to use. Because that was Australia's heyday. That was Australia in its prime, is when it was just where you had shiploads of criminals, you dropped them off on the shore of Australia, and you say, good luck. We'll see you never. And then you sail away. And I think that's what we should do. It's kind of a do-over sort of situation, a reset. I'm not going to say a great reset, but it's a reset for Australia.
But wait, there's more.
And level all the cities. We'll destroy the cities. And we'll do that safely. I'm not advocating that we harm anybody. We clear everybody out first. We make sure we do. And then we level all the cities and send the woke ones to a reservation in the desert, ship the other ones to New Zealand, and then we start sending our prisoners there. That's my plan. That's how we fix this thing. And that's how much I care. I care about Australia so much that I'm willing for it to be conquered in order to fix it. And the great thing is that we all know, based on recent history, that when America conquers a country, it fixes everything. It makes everything better. And I'd like to see that for all of you down in Australia.
And that is all we have time for this week on The Other Side. Please remember to follow us on Twitter, X, and YouTube at Other Side Oz. That's Other Side AUS. Please subscribe. Only about 20% of the people who watch the show on YouTube have subscribed. So just click that little subscribe button and click the notification bell, because that'll let you know when we put our clips out. Now, some people have told us that they're seeing stuff twice because they're watching the Friday night show and then they're seeing the shorter clips. So the way we do it, to be fully transparent about it, is we shoot the show for Friday for the weekend. That goes out on Friday night, the whole full show for an hour. Then we break it into clips and we play those throughout the week. And a clip drops every night at 8 p.m. And the clips are obviously shorter. And that's because some people like to watch the show in full and other people go, I don't want to sit down for a whole hour and listen to Damien. Yeah, frankly, I couldn't think of anything worse. And so it's better in shorter bites, yes. So we do it that way for those people. So please don't be offended. You'll see quite clearly that the two shows look different, and there are different playlists set up as well so that you can separate those two things. So please smash those subscribe buttons and please make comments. That also helps with all the magical algorithms that control us. And of course, a great place to join us is right here on ADH TV. That's adh.tv on any web browser, and it's completely free. And when you sign up on ADH, then you get all of our great other content. Alexandra Marshall, the wonderful Alexandra, Daisy Cousins, Spectator TV, Nick Cater, Church and State with Dave Pello, and all the special events up there for you to watch on demand too. We'll catch you next weekend for The Other Side. We drop a new show every Friday night at 8. I'm Damien Curry. Bye for now.